Section 17 of To the Last Man by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9, Part 1. Half a mile from the Isbel ranch, the cavalcade passed the log cabin of Evarts, father of the boy who had tended sheep with Bernardino. It suited Gaston Isbel to halt here. No need to call. Evarts and his son appeared so quickly as to convince observers that they had been watching. "Howdy, Jake," said Isbel. "I'm wanting a word with you alone." "Sure, boss. Get down and come in," replied Evarts. Isbel led him aside and said something forcible that Jean divined from the very gesture which accompanied it. His father was telling Evarts that he was not to join the Isbel Jorth war. Evarts had worked for the Isbels a long time, and his faithfulness, along with something stronger and darker, showed in his rugged face as he stubbornly opposed Isbel. The old man raised his voice. "No, I tell you, and that settles it." They returned to the horses, and before mounting, Isbel, as if he remembered something, directed his somber gaze on young Evarts. "Son, did you bury Bernardino?" "Dad and me went over yesterday," replied the lad. "I shore was glad the coyotes hadn't been round." "How about the sheep?" "I left them there. I was going to stay, but being all alone I got scared. The sheep was doing fine. Good water and some grass. And this ain't the time for varmints to hang around." "Jake, keep your eye on that flock," returned Isbel. "And if I shouldn't happen to come back you can call the sheep yours. I'd like your boy to ride up to the village, not with us, so anybody would see him, but afterward. We'll be at Abel Meeker's." Again Jean was confronted with an uneasy premonition as to some idea or plan his father had not shared with his followers. When the cavalcade started on again, Jean rode to his father's side and asked him why he had wanted the Evarts boy to come to Grass Valley. And the old man replied that, as the boy could run to and fro in the village without danger, he might be useful in reporting what was going on at Greaves's store, where undoubtedly the Jorth gang would hold forth. This appeared reasonable enough. Therefore Jean smothered the objection he had meant to make. The valley road was deserted. When, a mile farther on, the riders passed a group of cabins just on the outskirts of the village, Jean's quick eye caught sight of curious and evidently frightened people trying to see while they avoided being seen. No doubt the whole settlement was in a state of suspense and terror. Not unlikely this dark, closely grouped band of horsemen appeared to them as Jorth's gang had looked to Jean. It was an orderly, trotting march that manifested neither hurry nor excitement, but any Western eye could have caught the singular aspect of such a group, as if the intent of the riders was a visible thing. Soon they reached the outskirts of the village. Here their approach had been watched for or had been already reported. Jean saw men, women, children peeping from behind cabins and from half-open doors. Farther on, Jean espied the dark figures of men slipping out the back way through orchards and gardens and running north toward the center of the village. Could these be friends of the Jorth crowd, on the way with warnings of the approach of the Isbels? Jean felt convinced of it. He was learning that his father had not been absolutely correct in his estimation of the way Jorth and his followers were regarded by their neighbors. Not improbably, there were really many villagers who, being more interested in sheep raising than in cattle, had an honest leaning toward the Jorths. Some, too, no doubt, had leanings that were dishonest in deed, if not in sincerity. Gaston Isbel led his clan straight down the middle of the wide road of Grass Valley until he reached a point opposite Abel Meeker's cabin. Jean espied the same curiosity from behind Meeker's door and windows as had been shown all along the road. But presently, at Isbel's call, the door opened and a short, swarthy man appeared. He carried a rifle. "Howdy, Gass," he said. "What's the good word?" "Wal, Abel, it's not good, but bad, an' it's shore started," replied Isbel. "I'm askin' you to let me have your cabin." "You're welcome. I'll send the folks round to Jim's," returned Meeker. "An' if you want me, I'm with you, Isbel." "Thanks, Abel, but I'm not leadin' any more kin an' friends into this heah deal." "Wal, just as you say. But I'd like damn bad to join with you. My brother Ted was shot last night." "Ted! Is he dead?" ejaculated Isbel, blankly. "We can't find out," replied Meeker. "Jim says that Jeff Campbell said that Ted went into Greaves's place last night. Greaves was always friendly to Ted, but Greaves wasn't there." "No, he shore wasn't," interrupted Isbel with a dark smile. "An' he never will be there again." Meeker nodded with slow comprehension, and a shade crossed his face. "Wal, Campbell claimed he heard from some one who was there. Anyway, the Jorths were drinkin' hard an' they raised a row with Ted. Same old sheep talk, an' somebody shot him. Campbell said Ted was thrown out back an' he was shore he wasn't killed. Ah, wal, I'm sorry, Abel. Your family had to lose in this. Maybe Ted's not bad hurt. I shore hope so. An' you an' Jim keep out of the fight, anyway." "All right, Isbel. But I reckon I'll give you a hunch. If this heah fight lasts long the whole damn Basin will be in it on one side or the other." "Abel, you're talkin' sense," broke in Blaisdell. "An' that's why we're up heah for quick action." "I heard you got Daggs," whispered Meeker, as he peered all around. "Wal, you heard correct," drawled Blaisdell. Meeker muttered strong words into his beard. "Say, was Daggs in that Jorth outfit?" "He was. But he walked right into Jean's '44. An' I reckon his carcass would show some more." "An' where's Guy Isbel?" demanded Meeker. "Dead an' buried, Abel," replied Gaston Isbel. "An' now I'd be obliged if you would hurry your folks away an' let us have your cabin an' corral. Have you got any hay for the horses?" "Shore the barn's half full," replied Meeker, as he turned away. "Come on in." "No. We'll wait till you've gone." When Meeker had gone Isbel and his men sat their horses and looked about them and spoke low. Their advent had been expected, and the little town awoke to the imminence of the impending battle. Inside Meeker's house there was the sound of indistinct voices of women and the bustle incident to a hurried vacating. Across the wide road people were peering out on all sides, some hiding, others walking to and fro, from fence to fence, whispering in little groups. Down the wide road, at the point where it turned, stood Greaves's fort-like stone house. Low, flat, isolated, with its dark, eye-like windows, it presented a forbidding and sinister aspect. Jean distinctly saw the forms of men, some dark, others in shirt sleeves, come to the wide door and look down the road. "Wal, I reckon only about 500 good horse steps are separating us from that outfit," drawled Blaisdell. No one replied to his jocularity. Gaston Isbel's eyes narrowed to a slit in his furrowed face, and he kept them fastened upon Greaves's store. Blue likewise had a somber cast of countenance, not, perhaps, any darker nor grimmer than those of his comrades, but more representative of intense preoccupation of mind. The look of him thrilled Jean, who could sense its deadliness, yet could not grasp any more. Altogether, the manner of the villagers and the watchful pacing to and fro of the Jorth followers and the silent boding front of Isbel and his men summed up for Jean the menace of the moment that must very soon change to a terrible reality. At a call from Meeker, who stood at the back of the cabin, Gaston Isbel rode into the yard, followed by the others of his party. "Somebody look after the horses," ordered Isbel, as he dismounted and took his rifle and pack. "Better leave the saddles on, leastways till we see what's comin' off." Jean and Bill Isbel led the horses back to the corral. While watering and feeding them, Jean somehow received the impression that Bill was trying to speak, to confide in him, to unburden himself of some load. This peculiarity of Bill's had become marked when he was perfectly sober. Yet he had never spoken or even begun anything unusual. Upon the present occasion, however, Jean believed that his brother might have gotten rid of his emotion, or whatever it was, had they not been interrupted by Colmor. "Boys, the old man's orders are for us to sneak round on the three sides of Greaves's store, keeping out of gunshot till we find good cover, and then crawl closer to pick off any of Jorth's gang who shows himself." Bill Isbel strolled off without a reply to Colmor. "Wal, I don't think so much of that," said Jean, ponderingly. "Jorth has lots of friends here. Somebody might pick us off." "I kicked, but the old man shut me up. He's not to be bucked again now. Struck me as powerful queer. But no wonder." "Maybe he knows best. Did he say anythin' about what he an' the rest of them are goin' to do?" "Nope. Blue taxed him with that, an' he got the same as me. I reckon we'd better try it out, for a while, anyway." "Looks like he wants us to keep out of the fight," replied Jean, thoughtfully. "Maybe, though. Dad's no fool. Colmor, you wait here till I get out of sight. I'll go round and come up as close as advisable behind Greaves's store. You take the right side and keep hid." With that Jean strode off, going around the barn, straight out of the orchard lane to the open flat, and then climbing a fence to the north of the village. Presently he reached a line of sheds and corrals to which he held until he arrived at the road. This point was about a quarter of a mile from Greaves's store, and around the bend. Jean sighted no one. The road, the fields, the yards, the backs of the cabins, all looked deserted. A blight had settled down upon the peaceful activities of Grass Valley. Crossing the road, Jean began to circle until he came close to several cabins, around which he made a wide detour. This took him to the edge of the slope, where brush and thickets afforded him a safe passage to a line directly back of Greaves's store. Then he turned toward it. Soon he was again approaching a cabin of that side, and some of its inmates descried him. Their action attested to their alarm. Jean half expected a shot from this quarter, such were his growing doubts. But he was mistaken. A man, unknown to Jean, closely watched his guarded movements and then waved a hand as if to signify to Jean that he had nothing to fear. After this act he disappeared. Jean believed that he had been recognized by some one not antagonistic to the Isbels. Therefore he passed the cabin, and coming to a thick scrub oak tree that offered shelter, he hid there to watch. From this spot he could see the back of Greaves's store, at a distance probably too far for a rifle bullet to reach. Before him, as far as the store, on each side, extended the village common. In front of the store ran the road. Jean's position was such that he could not command sight of this road down toward Meeker's house, a fact that disturbed him. Not satisfied with this stand, he studied his surroundings in the hope of espying a better, and he discovered what he thought would be a more favorable position, although he could not see much farther down the road. Jean went back around the cabin, and coming out into the open to the right, he got the corner of Greaves's barn between him and the window of the store. Then he boldly hurried into the open, and soon reached an old wagon, from behind which he proposed to watch. He could not see either window or door of the store, but if any of the Jorth contingent came out the back way they would be within reach of his rifle. Jean took the risk of being shot at from either side. So sharp and roving was his sight that he soon espied Colmor slipping along behind the trees some 100 yards to the left. All his efforts to catch a glimpse of Bill, however, were fruitless. And this appeared strange to Jean, for there were several good places on the right from which Bill could have commanded the front of Greaves's store and the whole west side. Colmor disappeared among some shrubbery, and Jean seemed left alone to watch a deserted, silent village. Watching and listening, he felt that the time dragged, yet the shadows cast by the sun showed him that, no matter how tense he felt and how the moments seemed hours, they were really flying. Suddenly Jean's ears rang with the vibrant shock of a rifle report. He jerked up, strung and thrilling. It came from in front of the store. It was followed by revolver shots, heavy booming. 3 he counted, and the rest were too close together to enumerate. A single hoarse yell pealed out, somehow trenchant and triumphant. Other yells, not so wild and strange, muffled the first one. Then silence clamped down on the store and the open square. Jean was deadly certain that some of the Jorth clan would show themselves. He strained to still the trembling those sudden shots and that significant yell had caused him. No man appeared. No more sounds caught Jean's ears. The suspense then grew unbearable. It was not that he could not wait for an enemy to appear, but that he could not wait to learn what had happened. Every moment he stayed there with his hands like steel on his rifle, with eyes of a falcon, but added to the dreadful dark certainty of disaster. A rifle shot swiftly, followed by revolver shots. What could they mean? Revolver shots of different caliber, surely fired by different men. What could they mean? It was not these shots that accounted for Jean's dread, but the yell which had followed. All his intelligence and all his nerve were not sufficient to fight down the feeling of calamity. And at last, yielding to it, he left his post and ran like a deer across the open, through the cabin yard, and around the edge of the slope to the road. Here his caution brought him to a halt. Not a living thing crossed his vision. Breaking into a run, he soon reached the back of Meeker's place and entered the hurry forward to the cabin. Colmor was there in the yard, breathing hard, his face working, and in front of him crouched several of the men with rifles ready. The road, to Jean's flashing glance, was apparently deserted. Blue sat on the doorstep, lighting a cigarette. Then on the moment Blaisdell strode to the door of the cabin. Jean had never seen him look like that. "Jean, look down the road," he said, brokenly, and with big hand shaking he pointed down toward Greaves's store. Like lightning, Jean's glance shot down, 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 until it stopped to fix upon the prostrate form of a man lying in the middle of the road. A man of lengthy build, shirt-sleeved arms flung wide, white head in the dust, dead. Jean's recognition was as swift as his sight. His father. They had killed him, the Jorths. It was done. His father's premonition of death had not been false. And then, after these flashing thoughts, came a sense of blankness, momentarily almost oblivion, that gave place to a rending of the heart. The pain Jean had known only at the death of his mother. It passed, this agonizing pang, and its icy pressure yielded to a rushing gust of blood, fiery as hell. "Who did it?" whispered Jean. "Jorth," replied Blaisdell huskily. "Son, we couldn't hold your dad back. We couldn't. He was like a lion. And he throwed his life away. Oh, if it hadn't been for that, it'd not be so awful." "Shore. We come heah to shoot and be shot, but not like that. By God, it was murder murder!" Jean's mute lips framed a query easily read. "Tell him, Blue, I can't," continued Blaisdell, and he tramped back into the cabin. "Set down, Jean, and take things easy," said Blue, calmly. "You know we all reckoned we'd get plugged one way or another in this deal. An' shore it doesn't matter much how a fellar gets it. All that ought to bother us is to make sure the other outfit bites the dust, same as your dad had to." Under this man's tranquil presence, all the more quieting because it seemed so deadly sure and cool, Jean felt the uplift of his dark spirit, the acceptance of fatality, the mounting control of faculties that must wait. The little gunman seemed to have about his inert presence something that suggested a rattlesnake's inherent knowledge of its destructiveness. Jean sat down and wiped his clammy face. "Jean, your dad reckoned to square accounts with Jorth and save us all," began Blue, puffing out a cloud of smoke. "But he reckoned too late. Maybe years ago, or even not long ago, if he had called Jorth out man to man, there'd never been any Jorth Isbel war. Gaston Isbel's conscience woke too late. That's how I figure it." "Hurry. Tell me how it happened," panted Jean. "Wal, a little while after you left I seen your dad writing on a leaf he tore out of a book Meeker's Bible, as you can see. I thought that was funny. An' Blaisdell gave me a hunch. Pretty soon along comes young Evarts. The old man calls him out of our hearin' an' talks to him. Then I see him give the boy somethin' which I afterward figgered was what he wrote on the leaf out of the Bible. Me an' Blaisdell both tried to get out of him what that meant, but not a word. I kept watchin', an' after a while I seen young Evarts slip out the back way. Maybe half an hour I seen a bare-legged kid cross the road an' go into Greaves's store. Then shore I tumbled to your dad. He sent a note to Jorth to come out an' meet him face to face, man to man. Shore it was like readin' what your dad had wrote. But I didn't say nothin' to Blaisdell. I just watched." Blue drawled these last words as if he enjoyed remembrance of his keen reasoning. A smile wreathed his thin lips. He drew twice on the cigarette and emitted another cloud of smoke. Quite suddenly then he changed. He made a rapid gesture, the whip of a hand, significant and passionate, and swift words followed. Colonel Lee Jorth stalked out of the store, out into the road, maybe 100 steps. Then he halted. He wore his long black coat and his wide black hat, and he stood like a stone. "What the hell!" burst out Blaisdell, coming out of his trance. The rest of us just looked. I'd forgot your dad for a minute. So had all of us. But we remembered soon enough when we seen him stalk out. Everybody had a hunch then. I called him. Blaisdell begged him to come back. All the fellars had a say. No use. Then I shore cussed him and told him it was plain as day that Jorth didn't hit me like an honest man. I can sense such things. I knew Jorth had a trick up his sleeve. I've not been a gunfighter for nothin'. Your dad had no rifle. He packed his gun at his hip. He just stalked down that road like a giant, going faster and faster, holding his head high. It shore was fine to see him. But I was sick. I heard Blaisdell groan and Fredericks Starr cuss something fierce. When your dad halted, I reckon about 50 steps from Jorth. Then we all went numb. I heard your dad's voice, then Jorth's. They cut like knives. You could shore hear the hate they had for each other." Blue had become a little husky. His speech had grown gradually to denote his feeling. Underneath his serenity there was a different order of man. "I reckon both your dad and Jorth went for their guns at the same time, an even break. But just as they drew some one shot a rifle from the store. Must have been a .45-70, a big gun. The bullet must have hit your dad low down, about the middle. He acted that way, sinking to his knees, and he was wild in shooting, so wild that he must have missed. Then he wobbled, and Jorth run in a dozen steps, shooting fast, till your dad fell over. Jorth run closer and bent over him. Then he straightened up with an Apache yell, if I ever heard one. And then Jorth backed slow, looking all the time back to the store, and then went in." Blue's voice ceased. Jean seemed suddenly released from an impelling magnet that now dropped him to some numb, dizzy depth. Blue's lean face grew hazy. Then Jean bowed his head in his hands and sat there, while a slight tremor shook all his muscles at once. He grew deathly cold and deathly sick. This paroxysm slowly wore away, and Jean grew conscious of a dull amaze at the apparent deadness of his spirit. Blaisdell placed a huge, kindly hand on his shoulder. "Brace up, son," he said, with a voice now clear and resonant. "Shore it's what your dad expected, an' what we must all look for. If you was goin' to kill Jorth before, think how shore you're goin' to kill him now." "Blaisdell's talkin'," put in Blue, and his voice had a cold ring. "Lee Jorth will never see the sun rise again." These calls, to the primitive in Jean, to the Indian, were not in vain. But even so, when the dark tide rose in him, there was still a haunting consciousness of the cruelty of the singular doom imposed upon him. Strangely, Ellen Jorth's face floated back in the depths of his vision, pale, fading, like the face of a spirit floating by. "Blue," said Blaisdell, "let's get Isbel's body soon as we dare, and bury it. Reckon we can right after dark." "Shore," replied Blue. "But you fellars figure that out. I'm thinking hard. I've got something on my mind." Jean grew fascinated by the looks and speech and action of the little gunman. Blue indeed had something on his mind, and it boded ill to the men in that dark square stone house down the road. He paced to and fro in the yard, back and forth on the path to the gate, and then he entered the cabin to stalk up and down, faster and faster, until all at once he halted, as if struck, to upfling his right arm in a singular fierce gesture. "Jean, call the men in," he said, tersely. They all filed in, sinister and silent, with eager faces turned to the little Texan. His dominance showed markedly. End of chapter 9, part 1. Of To the Last Man by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9, part 2. "Gordon, you stand in the door and keep your eye peeled," went on Blue. "Now, boys, listen. I've thought it all out. This game of man hunting is the same to me as cattle raisin' is to you. An' my life in Texas all comes back to me, I reckon, in good stead for us now. I'm going to kill Lee Jorth. Him first, and maybe his brothers. I had to think of a good many ways before I hit on one I reckon will be sure. It's got to be sure. Jorth has got to die. Well, here's my plan. That Jorth outfit is drinking some. We can gamble on it. They're not going to leave that store, and of course they'll be expecting us to start a fight. I reckon they'll look for some such siege as they held round Isbel's ranch. But we shore ain't going to do that. I'm going to surprise that outfit. There's only one man among them who is dangerous, and that's Queen. I know Queen, but he doesn't know me, and I'm going to finish my job before he gets acquainted with me. After that, all right." Blue paused a moment, his eyes narrowing down, his whole face setting in a hard cast of intense preoccupation, as if he visualized a scene of extraordinary nature. "Well, what's your trick?" demanded Blaisdell. "You all know Greaves's store," continued Blue, "how them windows have wooden shutters that keep a light from showing outside. Well, I'm gamblin' that as soon as it's dark Jorth's gang will be celebratin'. They'll be drinkin' and they'll have a light and the windows will be shut. They're not goin' to worry none about us. That store is like a fort. It won't burn. An' shore they'll never think of us chargin' them in there. Well, as soon as it's dark we'll go round behind the lots an' come up jest across the road from Greaves's. I reckon we'd better leave Isbel where he lays till this fight's over. Maybe you'll have more 'n him to bury. We'll crawl behind them bushes in front of Coleman's yards. An' here's where Jean comes in. He'll take an ax, an' his guns, of course, an' do some of his Injun sneakin' round to the back of Greaves's store. An', Jean, you must do a slick job of this, but I reckon it'll be easy for you. Back there it'll be dark as pitch for any one lookin' out of the store, an' I'm figgerin' you can take your time an' crawl right up. Now, if you don't remember how Greaves's back yard looks, I'll tell you." Here Blue dropped on one knee to the floor, and with a finger he traced a map of Greaves's barn and fence, the back door and window, and especially a break in the stone foundation which led into a kind of cellar where Greaves stored wood and other things that could be left outdoors. "Jean, I take particular pains to show you where this hole is," said Blue, "because if the gang runs out you can duck in there and hide. And if they run out into the yard, well, you'll make it a sorry run for them. When you've crawled up close to Greaves's back door and waited long enough to see and listen, then you're to run fast and swing your ax smash against the window. Take a quick peep in if you want to. It might help. Then jump quick and take a swing at the door. You'll be standing to one side, so if the gang shoots through the door they won't hit you. Bang that door good and hard. Well, now's where I come in. When you swing that ax, I'll sure run to the front of the store. Jorth and his outfit will be some attentive to that pounding of yours on the back door, so I reckon, and they'll be looking that way. I'll run in, yell, and throw my guns on Jorth." "Humph! Is that all?" ejaculated Blaisdell. "I reckon that's all, and I'm figgerin' it's a hell of a lot," responded Blue, dryly. "That's what Jorth will think." "Where do we come in?" "Wal, you all can back me up," replied Blue, dubiously. "You see, my plan goes as far as killin' Jorth an' maybe his brothers. Maybe I'll get a crack at Queen, but I'll be sure of Jorth. After that all depends. Maybe it'll be easy for me to get out. An' if I do you fellows will know it an' can fill that storeroom full of bullets." "Wal, Blue, with all respect to you, I shore don't like your plan," declared Blaisdell. "Success depends on too many little things, any one of which might go wrong." "Blaisdell, I reckon I know this heah game better than you," replied Blue. "A gun fighter goes by instinct. This trick will work." "But suppose that front door of Greaves's store's barred," protested Blaisdell. "It hasn't got any bar," said Blue. "You shore?" "Yes, I reckon," replied Blue. "Hell, man, ain't you takin' a terrible chance?" queried Blaisdell. Blue's answer to that was a look that brought blood to Blaisdell's face. Only then did the rancher really comprehend how the little gunman had taken such desperate chances before and meant to take them now, not with any hope or assurance of escaping with his life, but to live up to his peculiar code of honor. "Blaisdell, did you ever hear of me in Texas?" he queried, dryly. "Wal, no, Blue. I can't swear I did," replied the rancher, apologetically. "An' Isbel was always sort of mysterious about his acquaintance with you." "My name's not Blue." "Ahuh! Wal, what is it, then, if I'm safe to ask?" returned Blaisdell, gruffly. "It's King Fisher," replied Blue. The shock that stiffened Blaisdell must have been communicated to the others. Jean certainly felt amaze, and some other emotion not fully realized, when he found himself face to face with one of the most notorious characters ever known in Texas, an outlaw long supposed to be dead. "Men, I reckon I'd kept my secret if I had any idea of comin' out of this Isbel Jorth war alive," said Blue. "But I'm goin' to cash. I feel it here. Isbel was my friend. He saved me from bein' lynched in Texas. An' so I'm goin' to kill Jorth. Now I'll take it kind of y'u, if any of y'u come out of this alive, to tell who I was an' why I was on the Isbel side. Because this sheep an' cattle war, this talk of Jorth an' the Hash Knife Gang, it makes me sick. I know there's been crooked work on Isbel's side, too. and I never want it on record that I killed Jorth because he was a rustler." "By God, Blue, it's late in the day for such talk," burst out Blaisdell in rage and amaze. "But I reckon you know what you're talking about. Well, I shore don't want to hear it." At this juncture Bill Isbel quietly entered the cabin, too late to hear any of Blue's statement. Jean was positive of that, for as Blue was speaking those last revealing words Bill's heavy boots had resounded on the gravel path outside. Yet something in Bill's look, or in the way Blue averted his lean face, or in the entrance of Bill at that particular moment, all of these together seemed to Jean to add further mystery to the long secret causes leading up to the Jorth Isbel war. Did Bill know what Blue knew? Jean had an inkling that he did. And on the moment, so perplexing and bitter, Jean gazed out of the door, down the deserted road to where his dead father lay, white-haired and ghastly in the sunlight. "Blue, you could have kept that to yourself as well as your real name," interposed Jean, with bitterness. "It's too late now for either to do any good. But I appreciate your friendship for Dad, and I'm ready to help carry out your plan." That decision of Jean's appeared to put an end to protest or argument from Blaisdell or any of the others. Blue's fleeting dark smile was one of satisfaction. Thereupon most of this group of men seemed to settle a grim restraint. They went out and walked and watched. They came in again, restless and somber. Jean thought that he must have bent his gaze 1,000 times down the road to the tragic figure of his father. That sight roused all emotions in his breast, and the one that stirred there most was pity. The pity of it. Gaston Isbel lying face down in the dust of the village street. Patches of blood showed on the back of his vest and one white-sleeved shoulder. He had been shot through. Every time Jean saw this blood he had to stifle a gathering of wild, savage impulses. Meanwhile the afternoon hours dragged by, and the village remained as if its inhabitants had abandoned it. Not even a dog showed on the side of the road. Jorth and some of his men came out in front of the store and sat on the steps in close convening groups. Every move they made seemed significant of their confidence and importance. About sunset they went back into the store, closing door and window shutters. Then Blaisdell called the Isbel faction to have food and drink. Jean felt no hunger, and Blue, who had kept apart from the others, showed no desire to eat. Neither did he smoke, though early in the day he had never been without a cigarette between his lips. Twilight fell and darkness came. Not a light showed anywhere in the blackness. "Wal, I reckon it's about time," said Blue, and he led the way out of the cabin to the back of the lot. Jean strolled behind him, carrying his rifle and an axe. Silently the other men followed. Blue turned to the left and led through the field until he came within sight of a dark line of trees. "That's where the road turns off," he said to Jean. "An' here's the back of Coleman's place. Wal, Jean, good luck." Jean felt the grip of a steel-like hand, and in the darkness he caught the gleam of Blue's eyes. Jean had no response in words for the laconic Blue, but he wrung the hard, thin hand and hurried away in the darkness. Once alone, his part of the business at hand rushed him into eager, thrilling action. This was the sort of work he was fitted to do. In this instance it was important, but it seemed to him that Blue had coolly taken the perilous part. And this cowboy with gray in his thin hair was in reality the great King Fisher. Jean marveled at the fact, and he shivered all over for Jorth. In 10 minutes, 15 more or less, Jorth would lie gasping bloody froth and sinking down. Something in the dark, lonely, silent, oppressive summer night told Jean this. He strode on swiftly. Crossing the road at a run, he He kept on over the ground he had traversed during the afternoon, and in a few moments he stood breathing hard at the edge of the common behind Greaves's store. A point of light penetrated the blackness. It made Jean's heart leap. The Jorth contingent were burning the big lamp that hung in the center of Greaves's store. Jean listened. Loud voices and coarse laughter sounded discord on the melancholy silence of the night. What Blue had called his instinct had surely guided him aright. Death of Gaston Isbel was being celebrated by revel. In a few moments Jean had regained his breath. Then all his faculties set intensely to the action at hand. He seemed to magnify his hearing and his sight. His movements made no sound. He gained the wagon, where he crouched a moment. The ground seemed a pale, obscure medium, hardly more real than the gloom above it. Through this gloom of night, which looked thick like a cloud but was really clear, shone the thin, bright point of light accentuating the black square that was Greaves's store. Above this stood a gray line of tree foliage, and then the intensely dark blue sky studded with white, cold stars. A hound bayed lonesomely somewhere in the distance. Voices of men sounded more distinctly, some deep and low, others loud, unguarded, with a vacant note of thoughtlessness. Jean gathered all his forces until sense of sight and hearing were in exquisite accord with the suppleness and lightness of his movements. He glided on about 10 short, swift steps before he halted. That was as far as his piercing eyes could penetrate. If there had been a guard stationed outside the store, Jean would have seen him before being seen. He saw the fence, reached it, entered the yard, glided in the dense shadow of the barn until the black square began to loom gray, the color of stone at night. Jean peered through the obscurity. No dark figure of a man showed against that gray wall, only a black patch, which must be the hole in the foundation mentioned. A ray of light now streaked out from the little black window. To the right showed the wide black door. Farther on Jean glided silently. Then he halted. There was no guard outside. Jean heard the clink of a cap, the lazy draw of a Texan, and then a strong, harsh voice, Jorth's. It strung Jean's whole being tight and vibrating. Inside he was on fire, while cold thrills rippled over his skin. It took tremendous effort of will to hold himself back another instant, to listen, to look, to feel, to make sure. And that instant charged him with a mighty current of hot blood, straining, throbbing, damning. When Jean leaped, this current burst. In a few swift bounds he gained his point halfway between the door and window. He leaned his rifle against the stone wall. Then he swung the axe. Crash! The window shutter split and rattled to the floor inside. The silence then broke with a hoarse, "What's that?" With all his might Jean swung the heavy axe on the door. Smash! The lower half caved in and banged to the floor. Bright light flared out of the hole. "Look out!" yelled a man in loud alarm. "They're battering the back door." Jean swung again, high on the splintered door. Crash! Pieces flew inside. "They've got axes," hoarsely shouted another voice. "Shove the counter ag'in' the door." "No," thundered a voice of authority that denoted terror as well. "Let them come in. Pull your guns and take cover." "They ain't comin' in," was the hoarse reply. "They'll shoot in on us from the dark." "Put out the lamp!" yelled another. Jean's third heavy swing caved in part of the upper half of the door. Shouts and curses intermingled with the sliding of benches across the floor and the hard shuffle of boots. This confusion seemed to be split and silenced by a piercing yell of different caliber, of terrible meaning. It stayed Jean's swing, caused him to drop the axe and snatch up his rifle. "Don't anybody move!" Like a steel whip this voice cut the silence. It belonged to Blue. Jean swiftly bent to put his eye to a crack in the door. Most of those visible seemed to have frozen into unnatural positions. Jorth stood in front of his men, hatless and coatless, one arm outstretched, and his dark profile set toward a little man just inside the door. This man was Blue. Jean needed only one flashing look at Blue's face, at his leveled, quivering guns, to understand why he had chosen this trick. "Who are you?" demanded Jorth in husky pants. "Reckon I'm Isbel's right-hand man," came the biting reply. "Once tolerable well known in Texas. King Fisher." The name must have been a guarantee of death. Jorth recognized this outlaw and realized his own fate. In the lamplight his face turned a pale greenish white. His outstretched hand began to quiver down. Blue's left gun seemed to leap up and flash red and explode. Several heavy reports merged almost as one. Jorth's arms jerked limply, flinging his gun, and his body sagged in the middle. His hands fluttered like crippled wings and found their way to his abdomen. His death pale face never changed its set look nor position toward Blue. But his gasping utterance was one of horrible mortal fury and terror. Then he began to sway, still with that strange, rigid set of his face toward his slayer, until he fell. His fall broke the spell. Even Blue, like the gunman he was, had paused to watch Jorth in his last mortal action. Jorth's followers began to draw and shoot. Jean saw Blue's return fire bring down a huge man who fell across Jorth's body. Then Jean, quick as the thought that actuated him, raised his rifle and shot at the big lamp. It burst in a flare. It crashed to the floor. Darkness followed, a blank, thick, enveloping mantle. Then red flashes of gun emphasized the blackness. Inside the store there broke loose a pandemonium of shots, yells, curses, and thudding boots. Jean shoved his rifle barrel inside the door, and holding it low down, he moved it to and fro while he worked lever and trigger until the magazine was empty. Then, drawing his six-shooter, he emptied that. A roar of rifles from the front of the store told Jean that his comrades had entered the fray. Bullets zipped through the door he had broken. Jean ran swiftly round the corner, taking care to sheer off a little to the left, and when he got clear of the building he saw a line of flashes in the middle of the road. Blaisdell and the others were firing into the door of the store. With nimble fingers Jean reloaded his rifle. Then swiftly he ran across the road and down to get behind his comrades. Their shooting had slackened. Jean saw dark forms coming his way. "Hello, Blaisdell!" he cried, warningly. "That you, Jean?" returned the rancher, looming up. "Wal, we wasn't worried about you." "Blue?" queried Jean, sharply. A little dark figure shuffled past Jean. "Howdy, Jean," said Blue, dryly. "You shore did your part. Reckon I'll need to be tied up, but I ain't hurt much." "Colmor's hit," cried the voice of Gordon, a few yards distant. "Help me, somebody." Jean ran to help Gordon uphold the swaying Colmor. "Are you hurt bad?" asked Jean, anxiously. The young man's head rolled and hung. He was breathing hard and did not reply. They almost had to carry him. "Come on, men," called Blaisdell, turning back toward the others who were still firing. "We'll let well enough alone. Fredericks, you and Bill help me find the body of the old man. It's here somewhere." Farther on down the road the searchers stumbled over Gaston Isbel. They picked him up and followed Jean and Gordon, who were supporting the wounded Colmor. Jean looked back to see Blue dragging himself along in the rear. It was too dark to see distinctly. Nevertheless, Jean got the impression that Blue was more severely wounded than he had claimed to be. The distance to Meeker's cabin was not far, but it took what Jean felt to be a long and anxious time to get there. Colmor apparently rallied somewhat. When this procession entered Meeker's yard, Blue was lagging behind. "Blue, how are you?" called Blaisdell with concern. "Wal, I got my boots on, anyhow," replied Blue, huskily. He lurched into the yard and slid down on the grass and stretched out. "Man, you're hurt bad!" exclaimed Blaisdell. The others halted in their slow march and, as if by tacit, unspoken word, lowered the body of Isbel to the ground. Then Blaisdell knelt beside Blue. Jean left Colmor to Gordon and hurried to peer down into Blue's dim face. "No, I ain't hurt," said Blue, in a much weaker voice. "I'm just killed. It was Queen. You heard me. Queen was only a bad man in that lot. I knowed it. I could have killed him, but I was after Lee Jorth an' his brothers." Blue's voice failed there. "Wal," ejaculated Blaisdell. "Shore was funny, Jorth's face, when I said Kingfisher," whispered Blue. "Funnier when I bored him through. But it was Queen." His whisper died away. "Blue!" called Blaisdell sharply. Receiving no answer, he bent lower in the starlight and placed a hand upon the man's breast. "Wal, he's gone. I wonder if he really was the old Texas Kingfisher. No one would ever believe it. But if he killed the Jorths I'll shore believe him." End of chapter 9, part 2. Of To the Last Man by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10, Part 1. 2 weeks of lonely solitude in the forest had worked incalculable change in Ellen Jorth. Late in June her father and her 2 uncles had packed and ridden off with Daggs, Colter, and 6 other men, all heavily armed, some somber with drink, others hard and grim with a foretaste of fight. Ellen had not been given any orders. Her father had forgotten to bid her good by or had avoided it. Their dark mission was stamped on their faces. They had gone, and, keen as had been Ellen's pang, nevertheless their departure was a relief. She had heard them bluster and brag so often that she had her doubts if any great Jorth Isbel wore. Barking dogs did not bite. Somebody, perhaps on each side, would be badly wounded, possibly killed, and then the feud would go on as before, mostly talk. Many of her former impressions had faded. Development had been so rapid and continuous in her that she could look back to a day-by-day transformation. At night she had hated the sight of herself, and when dawn came she would rise singing. Jorth had left Ellen at home with the Mexican woman and Antonio. Ellen saw them only at meal times, and often not then, for she frequently visited old John Sprague or came home late to do her own cooking. It was but a short distance up to Sprague's cabin, and since she had stopped riding the black horse, Spades, she walked. Spades was accustomed to having grain, and in the mornings he would come down to the ranch and whistle. Ellen had vowed she would never feed the horse and bade Antonio do it. But one morning Antonio was absent. She fed Spades herself. When she laid a hand on him and when he rubbed his nose against her shoulder, she was not quite so sure she hated him. "Why should I?" she queried. "A horse can't help it if he belongs to..." Ellen was not sure of anything, except more and more it grew good to be alone. A whole day in the lonely forest passed swiftly, yet it left a feeling of long time. She lived by her thoughts. Always the morning was bright, sunny, sweet, and fragrant and colorful, and her mood was pensive, wistful, dreamy. And always Just as surely as the hours passed, thought intruded upon her happiness, and thought brought memory, and memory brought shame, and shame brought fight. Sunset after sunset she had dragged herself back to the ranch, sullen and sick and beaten. Yet she never ceased to struggle. The July storms came, and the forest floor that had been so sere and brown and dry and dusty changed as if by magic. The green grass shot up, the flowers bloomed, and along the canyons beds of lacy ferns swayed in the wind and bent their graceful tips over the amber-colored waters. Ellen haunted these cool dells, these pine-shaded, mossy-rocked ravines, where the brooks tinkled and the deer came down to drink. She wandered alone, but there grew to be company in the aspens and the music of the little waterfalls. If she could have lived in that solitude always, never returning to the ranch home that reminded her of her name, she could have forgotten and have been happy. She loved the storms. It was a dry country, and she had learned through years to welcome the creamy clouds that rolled from the southwest. They came sailing and clustering and darkening at last to form a great purple angry mass that appeared to lodge against the mountain rim and burst into dazzling streaks of lightning and gray palls of rain. Lightning seldom struck near the ranch, but up on the rim there was never a storm that did not splinter and crash some of the noble pines. During the storm season sheep herders and woodsmen generally did not camp under the pines. Fear of lightning was inborn in the natives, but for Ellen the dazzling white streaks, or the tremendous splitting, crackling shock, or the thunderous boom and rumble along the battlements of the rim had no terrors. A storm eased her breast. Deep in her heart was a hidden gathering storm, and somehow to be out where the elements were warring, when the earth trembled and the heavens seemed to burst asunder, afforded her strange relief. The summer days became weeks, and farther they carried Ellen on the wings of solitude and loneliness, until she seemed to look back years at the self she had hated. And always, when the dark memory impinged upon peace, she fought and fought until she seemed to be fighting hatred itself. Scorn of scorn and hate of hate, yet even her battles grew to be dreams. For when the inevitable retrospect brought back Jean Isbel and his love and her cowardly falsehood, she would shudder a little bit and put an unconscious hand to her breast and utterly fail in her fight and drift off down to vague and wistful dreams. The clean and healing forest, with its whispering wind and imperious solitude, had come between Ellen and the meaning of the squalid sheep ranch, with its travesty of home, its tragic owner, and it was coming between her two selves, the one that she had been forced to be and the other that she did not know, the thinker, the dreamer, the romancer, the one who lived in fancy the life she loved. The summer morning dawned that brought Ellen strange tidings. They must have been created in her sleep and now were realized in the glorious burst of golden sun, in the sweep of creamy clouds across the blue, in the solemn music of the wind in the pines, in the wild screech of the blue jays and the noble bugle of a stag. These heralded the day as no ordinary day. Something was going to happen to her. She divined it, she felt it, and she trembled. Nothing beautiful, hopeful, wonderful could ever happen to Ellen Jorth. She had been born to disaster, to suffer, to be forgotten and die alone. Yet all nature about her seemed a magnificent rebuke to her morbidness. The same spirit that came out there with the thick amber light was in her. She lived, and something in her was stronger than mind. Ellen went to the door of her cabin, where she flung out her arms, driven to embrace this nameless purport of the morning. And a well-known voice broke in upon her rapture. "Well, lass, I like to see you happy, and I hate myself for comin', because I've been to Grass Valley for 2 days, and I've got news." Old John Sprague stood there, with a smile that did not hide a troubled look. "Oh, Uncle John, you startled me!" exclaimed Ellen, shocked back to reality. And slowly she added, "Grass Valley? News?" She put out an appealing hand, which Sprague quickly took in his own, as if to reassure her. "Yes, and not bad so far as you Jorths are concerned," he replied. "The first Jorth Isbel fight has come off. Reckon you remember making me promise to tell you if I heard anything? Well, I didn't wait for you to come up." So Ellen heard her voice calmly saying, what was this lying calm when there seemed to be a stone hammer at her heart? The first fight. Not so bad for the Jorths? Then it had been bad for the Isbels. A sudden cold stillness fell upon her senses. "Let's sit down outdoors," Sprague was saying. "Nice and sunny this mornin'. I declare I'm out of breath, not used to walkin'. And besides, I left Grass Valley in the night and I'm tired. But excuse me for hangin' round that village last night. There were shore " "Who was killed?" interrupted Ellen, her voice breaking low and deep. "Guy Isbel and Bill Jacobs on the Isbel side, and Daggs, Craig, and Greaves on your father's side," stated Sprague, with something of awed haste. "Ah!" breathed Ellen, and she relaxed to sink back against the cabin wall. Sprague seated himself on the log beside her, turning to face her, and he seemed burdened and grave with important matters. "I heard a good many conflicting stories," he said, earnestly. "The village folks is all scared, an' there's no believin' their gossip. But I got what happened straight from Jake Evarts. The fight come off day before yesterday. Your father's gang rode down to Isbel's ranch. Daggs was seen to be wantin' some of the Isbel hosses, so Evarts says, an' Guy Isbel an' Jacobs ran out in the pasture. Daggs an' some others shot them down." "Killed them that way?" put in Ellen, sharply. "So Evarts says. He was on the ridge an' swears he seen it all. They killed Guy an' Jacobs in cold blood. No chance for their lives, not even to fight. Well, then they surrounded the Isbel cabin. The fight lasted all that day an' all night an' the next day. Evarts says Guy an' Jacobs laid out there all this time. An' a herd of hogs broke in the pasture an' was eatin' the dead bodies." "My God!" burst out Ellen. "Uncle John, you shore can't mean my father wouldn't stop fighting long enough to drive the hogs off and bury those dead men." "Evarts says they stopped fighting all right, but it was to watch the hogs," declared Sprague. "An' then what d'you think? The women folks come out, the red headed one, Guy's wife, and Jacobs's wife. They drove the hogs away and buried their husbands right there in the pasture. Evarts says he has seen the graves." "It is the women who can teach these bloody Texans a lesson," declared Ellen, forcibly. "Well, Daggs was drunk, and he got up from behind where the gang was hidin' and dared the Isbels to come out. They shot him to pieces. And that night some one of the Isbels shot Craig, who was alone on guard. An' last this here's what I come to tell you Jean Isbel slipped up in the dark on Greaves and knifed him." "Why do you want to tell me that particularly?" asked Ellen, slowly. "Because I reckon the facts in the case are queer, and because, Ellen, your name was mentioned," announced Sprague, positively. "My name mentioned?" echoed Ellen. Her horror and disgust gave way to a quickening process of thought, a mounting astonishment. "By whom?" "Jean Isbel," replied Sprague, as if the name and the fact were momentous. Ellen sat still as a stone, her hands between her knees. Slowly she felt the blood recede from her face, pricking her kin down below her neck. That name locked her thought. "Ellen, it's a mighty queer story. Too queer to be a lie," went on Sprague. "Now you listen. Evarts got this from Ted Meeker, and Ted Meeker heard it from Greaves, who didn't die till the next day after Jean knifed him. And your dad shot Ted for tellin' what he heard. No, Greaves wasn't killed outright. He was cut something terrible in two places. They wrapped him all up, and next day packed him in a wagon back to Grass Valley. Evarts says Ted Meeker was friendly with Greaves and went to see him as he was layin' in his room next to the store. Well, according to Meeker's story, Greaves came to and talked. He said he was sitting there in the dark, shooting occasionally at Isbel's cabin, when he heard a rustling behind him in the grass. He knowed some one was crawling on him, but before he could get his gun around he was jumped by what he thought was a grizzly bear. But it was a man, and he shut off Greaves' wind and dragged him back in the ditch. And he said, 'Greaves, it's the half breed, and he's going to cut you, first for Ellen Jorth and then for Gaston Isbel.' Greaves said Jean ripped him with a bowie knife. And that was all Greaves remembered. He died soon after telling this story. He must have fought awful hard. The second cut Isbel gave him went clear through him. Some of the gang was there when Greaves talked, and naturally they wondered why Jean Isbel had said first for Ellen Jorth. Somebody remembered that Greaves had cast a slur on your good name, Ellen. And then they had Jean Isbel's reason for saying that to Greaves. It caused a lot of talk, and when Sim Bruce busted in, some of the gang haw-hawed him and said as how he'd get the third cut from Jean Isbel's bowie. Bruce was half drunk, and he began to cuss and rave about Jean Isbel being in love with his girl. As bad luck would have it, a couple of more fellars come in and asked Meeker questions. He just got to that part, Greaves, it's the half breed, and he's going to cut you, first for Ellen Jorth, when in walked your father. Then it all had to come out, what Jean Isbel had said and done, and why. How Greaves had backed Sim Bruce in slurring you." Sprague paused to look hard at Ellen. "Oh, then what did Dad do?" whispered Ellen. "He said, 'By God, half breed or not, there's one Isbel who's a man.' And he killed Bruce on the spot and gave Meeker a nasty wound. Somebody grabbed him before he could shoot Meeker again. They threw Meeker out, and he crawled to a neighbor's house where he was when Evarts seen him." Ellen felt Sprague's rough but kindly hand shaking her. "And now what do you think of Jean Isbel?" he queried. A great, unsurmountable wall seemed to obstruct Ellen's thought. It seemed gray in color. It moved toward her. It was inside her brain. "I tell you, Ellen Jorth," declared the old man, "that Jean Isbel loves you terribly, and he believes you're good." "Oh no, he doesn't," faltered Ellen. "Wal, he jest does." "Oh, Uncle John, he can't believe that," she cried. "Of course he can. He does. You are good as gold, Ellen, and he knows it. What a queer deal it all is, poor devil, to love you that terribly and have to fight your people. Ellen, your dad had it correct. Isbel or not, he's a man. And I say what a shame you two are divided by hate. Hate that you had nothing to do with." Sprague patted her head and rose to go. "Maybe that fight will end the trouble. I reckon it will. Don't cross bridges till you come to them, Ellen. I must hurry back now. I didn't take time to unpack my burros. Come up soon. And say, Ellen, don't think hard any more of that Jean Isbel." End of chapter 10, part 1. Of To the Last Man by Zane Grey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10, Part 2. Sprague strode away, and Ellen neither heard nor saw him go. She sat perfectly motionless, yet had a strange sensation of being lifted by invisible and mighty power. It was like movement felt in a dream. She was being impelled upward when her body seemed immovable as stone. When her blood beat down this deadlock of her physical being and rushed on and on through her veins, it gave her an irresistible impulse to fly, to sail through space, to run and run and run. And on the moment the black horse, Spades, coming from the meadow, whinnied at sight of her. Ellen leaped up and ran swiftly, but her feet seemed to be stumbling. She hugged the horse and buried her hot face in his mane and clung to him. Then just as violently she rushed for her saddle and bridle and carried the heavy weight as easily as if it had been an empty sack. Throwing them upon him, she buckled and strapped with strong, eager hands. It never occurred to her that she was not dressed to ride. Up she flung herself, and the horse, sensing her spirit, plunged in the strong, free gait down the canyon trail. The ride, the action, the thrill, the sensations of violence were not all she needed. Solitude, the empty aisles of the forest, the far miles of lonely wilderness, were these the added all? Spades took a swinging, rhythmic lope up the winding trail. The wind fanned her hot face. The sting of whipping aspen branches was pleasant. A deep rumble of thunder shook the sultry air. Up beyond the green slope of the canyon massed the creamy clouds, shading darker and darker. Spades loped on the levels, leaped the washes, trotted over the rocky ground, and took to a walk up the long slope. Ellen dropped the reins over the pommel. Her hands could not stay set on anything. They pressed her breast and flew out to caress the white aspens and to tear at the maple leaves and gather the lavender juniper berries, and came back again to her heart. Her heart that was going to burst or break. As it had swelled, so now it labored. It could not keep pace with her needs. All that was physical, all that was living in her, had to be unleashed. Spades gained the level forest. How the great brown-green pines seemed to bend their lofty branches over her, protectively, understandingly. Patches of azure blue sky flashed between the trees. The great white clouds sailed along with her, and shafts of golden sunlight, flecked with gleams of falling pine needles, shone down through the canopy overhead. Away in front of her, up the slow heave of forest land, boomed the heavy thunderbolts along the battlements of the Rim. Was she riding to escape from herself? For no gait suited her until Spades was running hard and fast through the glades. Then the pressure of dry wind, the thick odor of pine, the flashes of brown and green and gold and blue, the soft, rhythmic thuds of hoofs, the feel of the powerful horse under her, the whip of spruce branches on her muscles contracting and expanding in hard action, all these sensations seemed to quell for the time the mounting cataclysm in her heart. The oak swales, the maple thickets, the aspen groves, the pine-shaded aisles, and the miles of silver spruce all sped by her, as if she had ridden the wind, and through the forest ahead shone the vast open of the Basin, gloomed by purple and silver cloud, shadowed by gray storm, and in the west brightened by golden sky. Straight to the Rim she had ridden, and to the point where she had watched Jean Isbel that unforgettable day. She rode to the promontory behind the pine thicket and beheld a scene which stayed her restless hands upon her heaving breast. The world of sky and cloud and earthly abyss seemed one of storm-sundered grandeur. The air was sultry and still, and smelled of the peculiar burnt wood odor caused by lightning striking trees. A few heavy drops of rain were pattering down from the thin gray edge of clouds overhead. To the east hung the storm, a black cloud lodged against the rim, from which long misty veils of rain streamed down into the Gulf. The roar of rain sounded like the steady roar of the rapids of a river. Then a blue white, piercingly bright, ragged streak of lightning shot down out of the black cloud. It struck with a splitting report that shocked the very wall of rock under Ellen. Then the heavens seemed to burst open with thundering crash and close with mighty thundering boom. Long roar and longer rumble rolled away to the eastward. The rain poured down in roaring cataracts. The south held a panorama of purple shrouded range and canyon, canyon and range, on across the rolling leagues to the dim, lofty peaks, all canopied over with angry, dusky, low drifting clouds, horizon wide, smoky, and sulphurous. And as Ellen watched, hand pressed to her breast, feeling incalculable relief in sight of this tempest and gulf that resembled her soul, the sun burst out from behind the long bank of purple cloud in the west and flooded the world there with golden lightning. "It is for me," cried Ellen. "My mind, my heart, my very soul. Oh, I know now. I love him, love him, love him." She cried it out to the elements. "Oh, I love Jean Isbel, and my heart will burst or break." The might of her passion was like the blaze of the sun. Before it all else retreated, diminished. The suddenness of truth dimmed her sight, but she saw clearly enough to crawl into the pine thicket, through the clutching dry twigs, over the mats of fragrant needles to the covert where she had once spied upon Jean Isbel. And here she lay face down for a while, hands clutching the needles, breast pressed hard upon the ground, stricken and spent. But vitality was exceedingly strong in her. It passed that weakness of realization, and she awakened to the consciousness of love. But in the beginning it was not consciousness of the man. It was new, sensorial life, elemental, primitive, a liberation of a million inherited instincts, quivering and physical, over which Ellen had no more control than she had over the glory of the sun. If she thought at all, it was of her need to be hidden, like an animal, low down near the earth, covered by green thicket, lost in the wildness of nature. She went to nature, unconsciously seeking a mother. And love was a birth from the depths of her, like a rushing spring of pure water long underground, and at last propelled to the surface by a convulsion. Ellen gradually lost her tense rigidity and relaxed. Her body softened. She rolled over until her face caught the lacy golden shadows cast by sun and bough. Scattered drops of rain pattered around her. The air was hot, and its odor was that of dry pine and spruce fragrance penetrated by brimstone from the lightning. The nest where she lay was warm and sweet. No eye, save that of nature, saw her in her abandonment. An ineffable and exquisite smile wreathed her lips, dreamy, sad, sensuous, the supremacy of unconscious happiness. Over her dark and eloquent eyes, as Ellen gazed upward, spread a luminous film, a veil. She was looking intensely, yet she did not see. The wilderness enveloped her with its secretive, elemental sheaths of rock, of tree, of cloud, of sunlight. Through her thrilling skin poured the multiple and nameless sensations of the living organisms stirred to supreme sensitiveness. She could not lie still, but all her movements were gentle, involuntary. The slow reaching out of her hand to grasp at nothing visible was similar to the lazy stretching of her limbs, to the heave of her breast, to the ripple of muscle. Ellen knew not what she felt. To live that sublime hour was beyond thought. Such happiness was like the first dawn of the world to the sight of man. It had to do with bygone ages. Her heart, her blood, her flesh, her very bones were filled with instincts and emotions common to the race before intellect developed, when the savage lived only with his sensorial perceptions. Of all happiness, joy, bliss, rapture, to which man was heir, that of intense and exquisite preoccupation of the senses, unhindered and unburdened by thought, was the greatest. Ellen felt that which life meant with its inscrutable design. Love was the only realization of her mission on the earth. The dark storm cloud, with its white, ragged ropes of lightning and down streaming gray veils of rain, the purple Gulf rolling like a colored sea to the dim mountains, the glorious golden light of the sun, these had enchanted her eyes with her beauty of the universe. They had burst the windows of her blindness. When she crawled into the green brown covert it was to escape too great perception. She needed to be encompassed by close, tangible things. And there her body paid the tribute to the realization of life, shock, convulsion, pain, relaxation, and then unutterable and insupportable sensing of her environment and the heart. In one way she was a wild animal alone in the woods, forced into the mating that meant reproduction of its kind. In another she was an infinitely higher being, shot through and through with the most resistless and mysterious transport that life could give to flesh. And when that spell slackened its hold there wedged into her mind a consciousness of the man she loved, Jean Isbel. Then emotion and thought strove for mastery over her. It was not herself or love that she loved, but a living man. Suddenly he existed so clearly for her that she could see him, hear him, almost feel him. Her whole soul, her very life cried out to him for protection, for salvation, for love, for fulfillment. No denial, no doubt marred the white blaze of her realization. From the instant she had looked up into Jean Isbel's dark face she had loved him. Only she had not known. She bowed now, and bent, and humbly quivered under the mastery of something beyond her ken. Thought clung to the beginnings of her romance, to the 3 times she had seen him. Every look, every word, every act of his returned to her now in the light of the truth. Love at first sight? He had sworn it, bitterly, eloquently, scornful of her doubts. And now a blind, sweet, shuddering ecstasy swayed her. How weak and frail seemed her body! Too small, too slight, for this monstrous and terrible engine of fire and lightning and fury and glory. Her heart! It must burst or break. Relentlessly memory pursued Ellen, and her thoughts whirled and emotion conquered her. At last she quivered up to her knees, as if lashed to action. It seemed that first kiss of Isbel's, cool and gentle and timid, was on her lips. And her eyes closed and hot tears welled from under her lids. Her groping hands found only the dead twigs and pine boughs of the trees. Had she reached out to clasp him? Then hard and violent on her mouth and cheek and neck burned those other kisses of Isbel's, and with the flashing, stinging memory came the truth that now she would have bartered her soul for them. Utterly she surrendered to the resistlessness of his love. Her loss of mother and friends, her wandering from one wild place to another, her lonely life among bold and rough men, had developed her for violent love. It overthrew all pride. It engendered humility. It killed hate. Ellen wiped the tears from her eyes, and as she knelt there she swept to her breast a fragrant spreading bough of pine needles. "I'll go to him," she whispered. "I'll tell him of my love. I'll tell him to take me away away to the end of the world, away from here, before it's too late." It was a solemn, beautiful moment, but the last spoken words lingered hauntingly. "Too late?" she whispered. And suddenly it seemed that death itself shuddered in her soul. Too late? It was too late. She had killed his love. That Jorth blood in her, that poisonous hate, had chosen the only way to strike this noble Isbel to the heart. Basely, with abandonment of womanhood, she had mockingly perjured her soul with a vile lie. She writhed. She shook under the whip of this inconceivable fact. Lost! Lost! She wailed her misery. She might as well be what she had made Jean Isbel think she was. If she had been shamed before, she was now abased, degraded, lost in her own sight. And if she would given her soul for his kisses, she now would have killed herself to earn back his respect. Jean Isbel had given her at sight the deference she had unconsciously craved and the love that would have been her salvation. What a horrible mistake she had made of her life! Not her mother's blood, but her father's, the Jorth blood, had been her ruin. Again Ellen fell upon the soft pine needle mat, face down, and she groveled and burrowed there in an agony that could not bear the sense of light. All she had suffered was as nothing to this. To have awakened to a splendid and uplifting love for a man whom she had imagined she hated, who had fought for her name and had killed in revenge for the dishonor she had avowed. To have lost his love, and what was infinitely more precious to her now in her ignominy, his faith in her purity. This broke her heart. End of chapter 10, part 2.